For most of human history, economic life followed a pattern so consistent that it almost seemed like a law of nature. No matter how hard people worked, no matter how much societies advanced, most individuals remained trapped in a condition of subsistence. Income would occasionally rise, but those gains were almost always temporary. Population growth, war, disease, or famine would eventually push living standards back down. This cycle repeated itself for centuries. And then, beginning in the late 18th century, something profoundly unusual happened in England. For the first time in recorded history, economic growth did not simply rise and fall, it began to sustain itself. Output increased, productivity improved, and over time, income per person started to climb in a way that had never been seen before. This transformation is what we now call the Industrial Revolution. But while its long-term importance is widely accepted, one question has divided historians, economists, and thinkers for generations. What did this transformation actually mean for ordinary people living through it? Was it a story of progress, or a story of suffering? Did industrialization improve human life, or did it initially make it worse? Today, we're going to explore this question in depth, not through myths or simplified narratives, but through evidence, debate, and historical analysis. Between approximately 1760 and 1860, England underwent a transformation that fundamentally altered the structure of its economy and society. Before this period, production was largely decentralized. Goods were made in small workshops or even within homes. Skilled artisans and family labor dominated economic activity. Energy came from human effort, animals, water, and wind. But gradually, this system began to change. Technological innovations, particularly in textiles, metallurgy, and energy, made it possible to produce goods on a much larger scale. The introduction of machinery reduced the reliance on skilled manual labor, while the development of steam power freed production from geographic limitations tied to rivers and natural forces. Factories began to replace workshops. Production became concentrated. Labor became specialized. At the same time, improvements in transportation, canals, and later railways allowed goods to move more efficiently across regions. Markets expanded, trade intensified, and perhaps most importantly, capital accumulation increased. Investment in machinery, infrastructure, and industrial capacity created a feedback loop. More production generated more wealth, which in turn enabled further investment. By the early 19th century, England had effectively become what contemporaries described as the workshop of the world. But while this transformation generated wealth at the national level, it also disrupted traditional ways of life. And that disruption lies at the heart of the debate we're about to explore. The central controversy surrounding the Industrial Revolution is often referred to as the standard of living debate. At its core, the debate asks a deceptively simple question. Did ordinary people become better off as a result of industrialization? Historically, two opposing perspectives emerged. The first group, often called the pessimists, argued that the Industrial Revolution worsened the conditions of the working class, at least in its early stages. From this perspective, industrialization was not a story of progress, but one of exploitation and hardship. Workers moved from rural areas into rapidly expanding cities, where they encountered overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and high levels of pollution. Factory work was often repetitive, physically demanding, and dangerous. Working hours were long, and labor protections were virtually non-existent. Contemporary observers and writers captured these conditions vividly. The novels of Charles Dickens, for example, depict a world in which industrial society appears harsh, unequal, and morally troubling. Similarly, William Blake's famous reference to dark, satanic mills reflects a deep unease with the industrial transformation. To the pessimists, These were not isolated issues. They were systemic features of early industrial capitalism. In contrast, the optimists presented a very different interpretation. They argued that, despite the hardships, the Industrial Revolution marked the beginning of a long-term improvement in human well-being. From their perspective, industrialization increased the availability of goods, lowered prices, and gradually raised incomes. Over time, even ordinary workers gained access to items that had previously been considered luxuries. This was not merely economic growth, it was the beginning of a consumer revolution, in which material living standards expanded across broader segments of society. Over time, the ideological intensity of this debate began to fade. Modern scholars generally agree on one crucial point. The Industrial Revolution ultimately led to a dramatic increase in living standards compared to pre-industrial history. The disagreement today is no longer about whether living standards improved, but about when those improvements became meaningful for ordinary people. To answer this question, we need to confront a fundamental challenge. How do we measure living standards in the past? In an ideal world, we would measure well-being directly: happiness, life satisfaction, quality of life. But such measures are not available for historical populations. As a result, historians rely on indirect indicators, the most important of which are real wages and real income per person. Real wages represent the purchasing power of earnings. That is, how much goods and services workers can buy with their income after adjusting for the cost of living. Real income per person provides a broader measure of economic output divided across the population. However, these measures have significant limitations. They do not fully capture factors such as health outcomes, environmental conditions, job security, or the distribution of leisure time. Nor do they adequately reflect inequality, the fact that gains in income may be unevenly distributed. This means that even if real wages are rising, it does not necessarily follow that overall well-being is improving in a comprehensive sense. Understanding this limitation is essential, because much of the debate hinges on how we interpret these imperfect indicators. One of the most influential contributions to the optimist perspective came from economists Peter Lindert and Jeffrey Williamson. In their analysis of English wages between the mid-18th and mid-19th centuries, they constructed estimates of real wages across different types of workers. Their findings suggest a two-phase pattern. During the earlier period, roughly from the late 18th century to the early 19th century, real wages increased only slowly. But after around 1819, the pace of growth accelerated significantly. For many workers, particularly those in blue-collar occupations, real wages appear to have doubled between 1819 and 1851. If accurate, this would represent a remarkable improvement in material living standards within a relatively short period of time. However, these findings have been challenged on several grounds. Some researchers, such as Charles Feinstein, have argued that alternative methods of calculating the cost of living produce much lower estimates of wage growth. Others have pointed out that higher wages in urban areas may not reflect true improvements in well-being. Cities offered more employment opportunities and higher nominal wages, but they also imposed significant costs. Housing was expensive. Living conditions were often unsanitary. Pollution and disease were widespread. In this context, part of the wage increase may have functioned as compensation for deteriorating living conditions, rather than as a genuine increase in prosperity. Additionally, there is the issue of coverage. Most wage data focuses on individuals who were employed in formal labor markets. But large segments of the population, including self-employed workers and those engaged in informal or household production, are not well represented in these datasets. If these groups experience declining incomes, then aggregate measures based on wage earners alone may present an overly optimistic picture. To better understand the broader trajectory of living standards, we can look at estimates of real income per person. According to economic historian N. F. R. Crafts, income per person in Britain increased gradually between 1760 and 1830, and then more rapidly thereafter. The key point here is that early growth was extremely slow. At an annual rate of around 0.3%, improvements in average income would have been barely noticeable within a single generation. Under such conditions, even modest increases in inequality could offset the benefits of growth for large segments of the population. And there is substantial evidence suggesting that inequality did, in fact, increase during this period. This means that while the economy as a whole was expanding, many individuals may have seen little improvement, or even experienced a decline, in their standard of living. Statistics alone cannot fully capture the lived experience of industrialization. To understand that experience, we need to consider the social and environmental context in which people lived. Industrial cities grew rapidly, often without adequate planning or infrastructure. Housing shortages led to overcrowding. Sanitation systems were underdeveloped. Air and water pollution became serious problems. Factory work imposed new forms of discipline and routine. Workers were subject to strict schedules, repetitive tasks, and constant supervision. For many, this represented a profound shift from the relative autonomy of pre-industrial labor. Even if incomes were rising, the quality of daily life could still feel significantly worse. Despite these challenges, there is clear evidence that living standards improved over the long term. Life expectancy, for example, increased modestly during the Industrial Revolution. Consumption levels began to rise more noticeably after the early 19th century. And as industrialization spread, its benefits became more widely distributed. What makes the Industrial Revolution unique is not the speed of improvement in its early stages, but the fact that improvement became sustained and cumulative. For the first time, economic growth was no longer temporary. So what can we conclude? The Industrial Revolution was neither a simple story of progress, nor a straightforward narrative of exploitation. It was both. In the short term, it brought disruption, inequality, and hardship for many. In the long term, it created the foundation for unprecedented increases in human prosperity. Perhaps the most accurate way to understand it is this: the Industrial Revolution did not immediately improve life for everyone, but it made the modern world possible. And in doing so, it transformed the trajectory of human history in a way that continues to shape our lives today.